All right, it's 4:01, and I get to welcome everyone to this afternoon session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we'll be focusing on a recent book by Grace Katz called The Daughters of Yalta, The Churchills, Roosevelts, and Harrimans, A Story of Love and War, published last year by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt Press. I'm Eric Arneson from George Washington University. I'm the co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my longtime colleague, Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly, usually, if not always, on Mondays. Today, obviously, is a Friday, and in pre-COVID times, in person at the Wilson Center, since the pandemic restrictions in the virtual realm. And we have a full lineup of sessions still ahead for us this season that'll carry us into late June, including one this coming Monday, March 1st at 4 p.m., when we discuss Brandon Byrd's The Black Republic, African Americans and the Fate of Haiti, an event that we're co-sponsoring with the Omohundro Institute. And we hope you can join us for that session as well as today's. Behind the scenes, two people make these seminars possible: Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And thanks to our institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History in the Public Interest and the George Washington University Department of History, as well as any number of anonymous donors. As usual, we invite you to join their ranks. On the logistics front, you should know that today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of this webinar, we ask that those of you with questions use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. To those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Rachel Wheatley, whose email address is posted now in the chat function. We'll call on as many folks as we can. Today's session is being co-sponsored for the first time by the National Churchill Leadership Center based at the George Washington University. And it's my pleasure to introduce its program director, Justin Reich, who's also the executive director of the International Churchill Society. Justin.
Thank you, Eric, and welcome everyone today to today's seminar. I also like to thank Christian, the National History Center, and the Wilson Center for inviting the National Churchill Leadership Center to be a co-sponsor of this seminar. Opened in 2016, the National Churchill Leadership Center is a forum for the George Washington University community to debate and discuss issues relating to global leadership. Using Winston Churchill's legacy as a lens, it engages current and future leaders in politics, business, industry, and academia to facilitate a greater understanding of leadership and action. The Leadership Center was founded through the generosity of the International Churchill Society, which is a 501c3 membership nonprofit organization that exists to foster and support interest in the life, times, and legacy of Winston Churchill, ensuring that his legacy survives to inform and educate future generations and inspire the leaders of tomorrow. This society, and myself personally, was so pleased to have supported Catherine in her research and writing of this incredible book. It is a book that tells a new and accessible story of not only Winston Churchill, but of the other great war leaders through the eyes of those who knew them best, their daughters. Catherine has produced a great addition to the Churchill canon, and the book has produced many, many new lovers of history. So I congratulate Catherine, and I thank you all again for letting us co-sponsor this seminar.
Thank you very much, Justin. And with that, I turn the Zoom room screen over to Christian Osterman, who will be moderating today's session. Christian.
Thanks so much, Eric. Wonderful to see you all and have such a wonderful and large audience. And we hope to engage all of you in the discussion and the Q&A later on in the session. But we'll start, of course, with our featured speaker here today. And once Catherine has spoken, I'll introduce our two distinguished commentators. Dr. Kathleen Grace Katz is a writer and historian from Chicago. She graduated from Harvard in 2013 with a BA in history and received her MPhil in modern European history from Christ's College, University of Cambridge in 2014, where she wrote her dissertation on the origins of modern counterintelligence practices under the supervision of Professor David Reynolds, David being a veteran of the Washington History Seminar as well. After graduating, Catherine worked in finance in New York City before returning to history and writing. She's currently pursuing her JD at Harvard Law School. The Daughters of Yalta is her first book. Congratulations, Catherine, on the book, on the publication, and welcome to the Washington History Seminar. The Zoom room is yours.
Thank you so much, Christian. And thank you, Eric and Justin, for this lovely introduction and the collaboration of so many folks hosting this today. I so greatly appreciate the opportunity to participate here. Your program has hosted so many historians that I admire, including my former supervisor, David Reynolds, who I had the opportunity to hear earlier this year, or last year at this point. So it was a great pleasure to hear him speak about his new book and to continue learning about history in all shapes and forms. So thank you so much for having me and giving me the opportunity to chat with all of you attending today, especially on a Friday afternoon. So I would love to start by showing a couple of photographs to set the scene for the Yalta Conference as we know it, and the Yalta Conference as perhaps we don't quite know it. So I will share my screen with you now. And I love to start with this photograph because it really is the iconic picture of Yalta that we know from our history textbooks. This is one of the most famous images of the war, one of the iconic pictures of the big three, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. And it was taken in the courtyard of Levadia Palace in February 1945 during the Yalta Conference. You can see their military advisors behind them. And you can also see the grim look on each of their faces. They really look as if they have the weight of the world on their shoulders, and rightly so. They've been at war for half a decade, and the issues they've come to discuss would certainly keep anyone up at night, not least having numerous issues to discuss of this nature. One of the primary issues is what to do about Germany in the near future. It looks like finally, after such a long time, that the war in Europe will probably draw to a close sometime in late spring, early summer 45. The Battle of the Bulge has just ended, and now the race is on to see who will be the first to liberate Berlin. At this point, they're trying to determine, should Germany be allowed to remain one state, or should it be broken up into smaller states in hopes that will prevent them from rising up as a belligerent for a third time in a century? Also very important at this time, especially to Winston Churchill, is the fate of Poland and Polish sovereignty. Britain went to war in defense of Polish sovereignty at the outset, and the Polish government has been in exile in London ever since. Churchill does not want to return home and tell his colleagues that they have failed to secure what they set out to defend at the beginning of the war. Stalin, however, has other designs. He is looking at Poland and sees a great source of vulnerability that has existed ever since the Napoleonic era during the Tsarist period. The Soviet Union and Russia, the Russian Empire before, has been invaded multiple times through the flatlands of Poland, most recently by the Nazis. And Stalin wants to make sure that when this is all over, after all the Soviets' contributions to winning the war, that they will have friendly neighbors on their borders, that the government in Poland will be friendly to the interests in Moscow. He can back this desire up with the force of the Red Army, which has boots on the ground across Eastern Europe and especially in Poland. So this is setting Churchill and Stalin up for a bit of a clash as they head into the Yalta Conference. Roosevelt's attention is somewhat more oriented towards the Pacific, where the war is not quite as advanced as it is in Europe. At this point, they don't yet know if the Manhattan Project will be a success, if the atomic bomb will be an option. Iwo Jima has not yet happened. That occurs just after Yalta. So Roosevelt is looking at a potential ground invasion of the Japanese home islands, which could potentially lead to the deaths of 200,000 American soldiers. He wants to save as many American lives as possible, and the way he envisions doing this is by bringing the Soviets into the war against Japan. The Japanese and Soviets have had a pact of neutrality since the beginning of the war. However, in exchange for some territorial concessions in the region, Roosevelt believes he can bring Stalin and the Soviets into the war in the Pacific 3 months after the war in Europe ends. And finally, Roosevelt has somewhat of a personal goal as well. He wants to succeed where Woodrow Wilson failed at the end of World War I and create a lasting institution for peace that brings together the international community. This is, of course, the United Nations, and he wants to secure Soviet cooperation in this new venture, which he believes can secure not, perhaps eternal peace, as that's perhaps too lofty a dream, but certainly peace in Europe for at least 50 years. He also sees the United Nations as a way of bringing the Soviet Union into the international community after the common enemy has been defeated. The other thing that I think is really interesting to consider, looking at this photograph, looking at how exhausted each of them are at this time, is just what it took to get to Yalta. And this is something that I don't know that everybody thinks about, especially, if you're learning about Yalta in school and approaching the end of the war. The school year is almost over, time to move on to the end. However, I think it's really interesting to consider, at this point, it is still a very dangerous journey for these leaders to travel to meet together, but they feel that it's imperative that they meet in person. For Stalin, he knows that he holds more cards than do his partners at this point in the war. And so if they want to meet, they're going to have to come to him. He doesn't want to leave his security apparatus. He says it's because his doctors say it's bad for his health to travel. He's also afraid of flying. Meanwhile, Roosevelt is actually dying of congestive heart failure, though the others do not know this. But he and Churchill agree to make this arduous journey. Churchill travels first by plane to Malta, where he'll rendezvous with Roosevelt. But tragically, on the way, the Brits lose a plane. One of their planes carrying Foreign Office experts go down off the coast of Italy. Several members of the Foreign Office are killed. It really casts a pall over the beginning of this conference for them. Meanwhile, Roosevelt makes a week-long journey in a destroyer convoy across the Atlantic Ocean, where they're still sighting enemy U-boats. They meet at Malta, which has led to the apocryphal Stalin quip, "I said Yalta, not Malta." And then they have to fly a further almost 1,400 miles over enemy-occupied islands where they're anti-aircraft units. But they finally land in the Crimea at Saki Airfield with a dangerously short runway. Then they have to travel a further 6 hours by car over battle-scarred roads, sometimes at no more than 20 miles an hour. So a bit of an arduous journey to finally arrive at the Tsar's former summer palace. This was the summer home of Tsar Nicholas II and his family, and it really was a country family retreat in the sense, away from the pressures of court, where they did activities like played tennis and swam. But of course, after the Russian Revolution, this building, like so many others, was nationalized, turned into a rest home for favored Soviet workers. When the war broke out and the Nazis invaded the Crimea, they used Levadia Palace as their Crimean headquarters. And when the Soviets pushed them out, the Nazis stripped the palace of everything they could carry: the furniture, the lamps, the art, the dishes, even down to the doorknobs, which they could melt down as scrap metal. So the Soviets then, once the big three agree that this is where they're going to meet, they have just 3 weeks to turn this ransacked palace into a site that's fit for the kind of summit that is occurring here on this precipice as we see it now between World War and Cold War. So they do what the Soviets do best. They throw manpower at the situation, which entails taking the contents of glamorous hotels in Moscow, like the Hotel Metropole and the Hotel National, and putting everything in the hotel on trains and carting it 1,000 miles south to restock this palace, even going so far as to requisition the other items that they need, like coat hangers and ashtrays, out of local homes, homes of, belonging to people whose lives had been largely destroyed by the war. So I think that the sense of place certainly informs the sense of foreboding also that is present at the Yalta Conference as it begins. But returning to this photograph again, I like to think about this picture and then compare it with another photograph, which was taken from the almost the exact same moment, same scene, but from a slightly different perspective. And in it, you can see something slightly different. And this is not a photograph that I had seen before. And you can see off to the side of the same scene, there are two young women in the background. These two young women are Sarah Churchill and Kathleen Harriman. Sarah Churchill is 30 years old. She's, of course, the Prime Minister's daughter. Kathleen Harriman is 27, and she is the daughter of the US Ambassador to the Soviet Union, Avril Harriman. And there's a third daughter who's just outside the frame of this photograph, but you can see her in newsreel footage of the same scene, and that's Anna Roosevelt, who is 38 and, of course, is FDR's daughter. And so, looking at these two photographs, it really brought a number of questions to mind. First, I began to think of all the people, these leaders, who they could have brought with them to serve as their aides at Yalta. Why did they bring their daughters? What was it about their specific skills and experiences and abilities that made them the perfect partner to serve with them at this incredibly important moment in 20th century history, a moment that they all knew as they were living through it would be fundamentally important to the outcome of the next 50 years? It also made me stop and think, we have these leaders that we put on a pedestal to the extent that they become more than human, and it's difficult to relate to them as people after admiring and idolizing them for such a long time. However, for these people, they're also somebody's dad. And what would it be like for this person to be your parent and to be their daughter living through this moment of history together? For me, this story really began with Sarah Churchill, and the story in history also begins with Sarah Churchill. Sarah Churchill, if people know her today, it's often in the context of having been an actress and a dancer. She starred in a movie in 1951 called Royal Wedding, where she starred opposite Fred Astaire. But I began to know Sarah first through a fortuitous coincidence. I had studied history at Harvard, where I spent a lot of time studying Winston Churchill. However, during the Boer War for my thesis on British prisoner of war escape narratives. And I am sure Professor Plokey has no memory of this, but you actually were one of my thesis readers at the time. So thank you very much for the positive grade on that. So I spent a lot of time with Churchill. And then when I went to Cambridge for my MPhil, again, spent coincidentally and unintentionally a lot of time studying Churchill again, but this time during the First World War, looking at his role as Home Secretary in the postal censorship initiative that they enacted during the First World War to try to root out enemy spies in Britain. So it spent the last 2 years with Winston Churchill on my mind, but I did what many recent graduates do and went to work in New York in finance and quickly realized it's not what I wanted to do. But by sheer coincidence, in the lobby of my office was a bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers, which specializes in books by and about Winston Churchill. And I used to go into the bookstore when I needed a break from Excel modeling, and I got to know the owner after so many visits. And he suggested that I meet the International Churchill Society, which is made up of, as Justin explained, scholars and academics, as well as professionals who want to encourage the study of Winston Churchill and history and international relations, as well as encourage younger people to go into public service in the spirit of Churchill. I was fortunate enough to be able to attend a dinner that spring at the Waldorf Hotel hosted by the Churchill Society, where Madeleine Albright was speaking, which was a wonderful experience. But I also had the opportunity to meet several members of the Churchill family. And shortly thereafter, I learned that they were opening the papers of Winston's middle daughter, Sarah, to outside researchers for the first time. They asked if I would be interested in writing an article for the Churchill Society journal, Finest Hour. I said I would love to do this. I thought it would be a great way to stay engaged with history while I figured out how to find my way back to it. So off I went to Cambridge to learn more about Sarah. And as soon as I began to read through her papers, I became fascinated, not by her career as an actress, but by her activity during the war. She and her father had a very close relationship since she was a little girl, really forged through their time together in the garden, where he would spend many hours bricklaying, which was one of his favorite pastimes for relaxation. And through those hours together, Sarah came to really understand the way her father's mind worked. She said that she could walk in silent step with him. Even if he wasn't speaking, she knew exactly what he was thinking. She set aside her career as an actress to do her bit in the war. She joined the women's branch of the RAF. She became a reconnaissance intelligence analyst, looking at photographs that had been taken thousands of feet in the sky by recon pilots and making intelligence assessments in support of Allied operations, especially in the Mediterranean. And through her work, she became very familiar with the intimate details of Allied operations, even sometimes in more detail than her father, much to his great amusement and great pride. Early in the war, the Churchills had agreed that when Winston traveled abroad, he should bring someone from the family with him as a sort of supporter and confidant of sorts, but also as an unofficial family historian. They knew he would want to write his war memoirs after the war was over, and so that someone should go with him to record what was taking place outside of the official meetings. Sarah was the perfect person to do this. Not only did she have the deportment of an actress, which lends itself so well to diplomacy. There is much about diplomacy that is a lot like acting. She understood her father, the way her father's mind worked, and could really serve as his counsel and conscience. But also she knew the details of the war, and she could write about them. She was a beautiful writer, much like her father, her language really reflecting the command of language that he had. And so for all these reasons, she was the perfect person to join him as his aide, first in 1943 at the Tehran Conference, the first meeting of the Big Three as they're laying the plans for the Normandy invasion. At this conference, others took notice of just how valuable she was to her father, even though she was an untraditional sort of aide. And two of these people were Averell Harriman and FDR. Averell Harriman was not especially close to his daughter when she was a little girl. He was off traveling the world in pursuit of his business enterprises. He was the chairman of Union Pacific Railroad, the founder of Brown Brothers Harriman. He had shipping conglomerates, manganese mine investments in the Soviet Union. And he was also the founder of Sun Valley ski resort, which was the first of its kind in the United States. And it was only after Averil Harriman and his wife had divorced when his daughter was young. And it was only after she was a teenager and her mother passed away that she began to build a very strong bond with her father through their shared love of adventure and sport. She began to work with him during her college vacations at Sun Valley, primarily because she was an incredible athlete. She was a great equestrian and crack shot, but also an Olympic level skier. Averil Harriman, for someone who was not a warm and fuzzy father by any means, was surprisingly ahead of his time compared to many fathers of his era in wanting to involve his daughters in his professional life to the extent that it interested them. Kathleen's older sister, Mary, was not as interested in participating in this world, but Kathleen really jumped at the chance to join him in his business endeavors and to get to know her father in his world. Averil Harriman had become part of the Roosevelt's New Deal administration and had become very close friends with Harry Hopkins. And in 1941, when Roosevelt enacted Lend-Lease, he sent Averil Harriman as his envoy to London to be the Lend-Lease envoy and also to build a close relationship with Churchill, which Harriman did. He also thought it would be a great opportunity for his daughter, who was just 23, to come with him in the middle of the Blitz and work as a war reporter. So off Kathleen went in the middle of the Blitz, and she too became very close friends with the Churchills. So close, in fact, that they were celebrating her 24th birthday when they all learned the news about Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. In 1943, Averil Harriman became the ambassador to the Soviet Union. Kathleen went with her father to Moscow, where she learned to speak Russian for both of them. She also became in many ways like his assistant ambassador, or as we think of today, like a protocol officer at the State Department of sorts. And in doing so, she became the American woman who had more access to and experience with Stalin's inner circle than any other American woman in history. When it came time for the Yalta Conference, Harriman remembered the value that Sarah Churchill had brought to her father at Tehran 2 years earlier. And so he asked his daughter to come with him and to serve as a liaison between the Soviets and the Americans in the preparations for the conference, putting her Russian language skills to work, and also allowing him to have a broader footprint and influence at the conference. At this time, he was drifting farther away from Roosevelt in his assessment of how to deal with the Soviet Union, both at Yalta and in the future. And he had come to see more closely the point of view that Churchill had of Stalin at the time. And so Kathleen's activity there, it kind of almost asserted Harriman in a sense as an individual presence of his own of sorts. And he and his daughter worked as a team. She was his confidant in those late night conversations about his frustrations working with the Soviet leadership, especially the foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov. And at one point in the conference, she's even asked to get up and give a toast in Russian on behalf of the three daughters to Stalin and the Soviet leadership, which, thinking of, I was 27 years old as I was writing this book. Kathleen was 27 at Yalta. And what would it be like to be that age and to be asked to give this speech in a language I had just learned to some of the most fearsome individuals of the 20th century? This is actually a photograph of Kathleen with a horse that was gifted to her by Stalin at the end of her time in Moscow. Anna Roosevelt was the third of the three daughters, and she and her father had a very close relationship when she was a little girl. They really had a shared passion for the natural world and conservation, and she dreamed that someday she and her father would become the co-custodians of sorts of Hyde Park. However, all of this changed when he was diagnosed with polio and was paralyzed. Anna suddenly found herself on the outside looking in. He was surrounded by doctors and nurses all the time. His political colleagues now had to come to him. She was sent away to school, expected to become a debutante, which was something she really resisted. And yet, despite being such progressive individuals in many ways, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt insisted that she follow the debutante path and did not see her as someone who would have a career. She spent a brief amount of time at Cornell before making a rebellious marriage and had 2 children, but sadly the marriage didn't last. And she ended up then shortly thereafter falling in love with a Republican journalist who worked for William Randolph Hearst, one of FDR's chief critics, while on the campaign trail with her father. She and John Boettiger married and moved to Seattle, where they became the editors of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper. But in 1943, he joined the army and Anna moved home to the White House, where she began to notice something was not quite right about her father. He just was, staring off into space, he couldn't get enough oxygen. And she was very alarmed at this change in him that she hadn't noticed before. And so she insisted he have a comprehensive medical examination, which doctor. And FDR surprisingly never wanted to know what was wrong with him. You can understand, of course, being a wartime president, this is something that you just can't cope with while you're trying to also lead the country and win a war. And so a lot of the pressure then fell on Anna. Eleanor couldn't really see the difference, didn't want to open to her eyes to the change. So Anna became his gatekeeper in many ways, helping to determine who really needed an appointment with the president and who could meet with someone else, even sometimes going so far as to take papers out of his inbox at night and distribute them to others who she felt could handle them so he needn't be bothered. For years, she'd been asking to come with him for one of his overseas conferences, but he'd always turned to one of his sons, Anna's younger brothers, instead to help him, largely as a physical supporter, to help him stand and move, for example, at the Atlantic Charter meeting with Churchill. But at this point, even though he doesn't know what's wrong with him, he can sense that Anna's doing something to protect him. And so in January 1945, he cables Churchill and says, if you're thinking of bringing Sarah to this conference, I think I'll bring my daughter Anna as well. So Anna finally gets her chance to be at her father's side and to recapture the closeness with him that she remembered from the time she was a little girl. But she also knows that this is probably her last chance. He's dying, and her days with him, to be invaluable to him in the way she knows that she can be, are very short-lived. And so off she goes to Yalta, really as his secret keeper, keeping the secret of his health, this incredible burden that she can't tell anyone, but everybody's speculating about, and also other secrets such as his affair with Lucy Mercer, which she's carrying for him and hiding from her mother. So you can imagine the amount of pressure that Anna's facing, really, finally having the chance to achieve this lifelong dream. And experience history in the making, as she knows it is while she's living through it. But also just the tragedy of having these last moments with her father burdened by these secrets that are really unfair for any child to have to bear on behalf of your parent. So for each of the three daughters at the Yalta Conference, their roles there were slightly different, but yet I think that we can think of them as, in a way I like to think of as daughter diplomats, where they're at Yalta not necessarily as someone from the State Department or the Foreign Office might be, but really, in this kind of betwixt and between quasi-official role, where they don't speak for the government per se, but they speak with the weight of their fathers behind them. And they're able to have conversations and deliver nuanced messages and report back to their fathers, these kinds of conversations that somebody in a more official capacity might not be able to have. They're also able to go out into the local community and meet the people whose lives are literally being reordered by the conversations their fathers are having around the conference table at that very moment, and report back to their fathers about what they've seen, the very powerful scenes, and kind of also bringing some sense of the difference between the Soviet leadership and the Soviet citizens. And they find in that moment, it's reasons to hope, even though there is great trepidation about the near future in dealing with Stalin and his leadership. I also think, just to bring this to a close quickly, there are a couple of things that stand out to me that the experience of the daughters at the Yalta Conference can inform us about today in our own world. And one of these, through their eyes, you can really see the frustration of the attempt to build a personal bond with the Soviet leader. Roosevelt believes that he can build the same kind of friendship with Stalin that he did with Churchill, and that this can be the bedrock of a future relationship after the common enemy has been defeated. But you can see the frustration as this is trying and failing through the eyes of the daughters. And unfortunately, I think this the attempt to build a personal bond with the Russian leader is something that presidents have tried to do for the last 75 years, certainly, George Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and unfortunately just is not the winning strategy that we might like it to be, as it might be with a leader from another country. I also think the role of the daughters at Yalta brings to mind questions about what is the appropriate role for the unelected family members of an elected official to play in their public duties. To some extent, it's like when you marry someone, you marry their family. In a way, when you elect someone, you elect their family as well. And we acknowledge there should be a role for a first spouse in a more official way, but what about adult first children? Until the most recent administration, that's something we hadn't really had to think about, because more recent presidents had very young children in the White House. I'd argue that what the daughters were doing at Yalta was very different from, for example, Ivanka Trump's activity at the G20 in 2018. They're not in the conference meetings. They don't have the security clearance, but that's not at all to say that they aren't powerful and don't have influence as well, but in a different way. And finally, I'm so glad that we have the opportunity to be together on Zoom and communicate all across the world. But I also think that the feeling that Churchill and Roosevelt had, that it was imperative to meet with Stalin, really informs the importance of in-person diplomacy. I think especially in a place like Russia, where so much, what you see on the surface is not really the reality if you just look behind the curtain. It really does stress the importance, especially where there are perhaps clashes between cultures and history, to have those meetings in person, and also to be able to gather in international institutions like the United Nations, which is one of the legacies of the Yalta Conference. So I hope that as soon as this global crisis has passed, that we can be able to gather in person, especially to discuss some of the most important affairs of state and geopolitics. So I'll leave it there and look forward to having the conversation with all of you.
Thanks so much, Catherine, for this wonderful overview over the book. We're now very fortunate to have two very distinguished historians to provide initial comments on your presentation, on the book, on aspects of the book, and to launch us into our conversation that I hope will involve many of you in the audience as well. We have a very distinguished audience. I see Avis Boland is in the audience, the daughter of yet another diplomat who was at Yalta. So we will have time for that. And I welcome or encourage you to already get in line, get in queue by using the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality as we embark on our comments. We'll start with Professor Alida Black, who is special advisor and historian to former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, and visiting distinguished scholar at the Miller Center for the Study of the Presidency at the University of Virginia. She also advises former Liberian President and Nobel Prize laureate Ellen Johnson Sirleaf on her archive and other projects. In 2019, she began a Hewlett Foundation-funded case study of the bipartisan legislative negotiations to rebuild Lower Manhattan in the aftermath of 9/11. Last year, she was invited to join Georgetown University's US-China Study Group on Women and Society. She's recognized widely internationally as an expert on Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She's written and edited 10 books, as well as a variety of articles on women, politics, and human rights policy. She's led workshops around the world on human rights, conflict resolution, and women and girls empowerment. Clearly, you're a very busy person.
Oh, Christian, hush. Just say I do, Eleanor. All right.
Okay. Clearly, you're a very busy person, so we're delighted you're taking the time to engage with us. Engage, especially Catherine, with your questions and comments. Yeah. And we'll allow Catherine to respond immediately to your questions before we move to Siri.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for asking me to be a part of this. I can't think of a better way to celebrate the day before my birthday, Catherine, than talking about your book, which I enjoyed very much, but which raised a lot of questions for me. So I'm just going to start by saying, I just think your work on Sarah and Kathy was just out of the ballpark. I mean, I loved it. I'm going to give you a little friendly sparring match, if you will, on Anna, because I come through this through a different lens when I read this book. Unlike Churchill, I hope I said your name right, I apologize, but I am not a Ukrainian expert. I look at Yalta through the lens of Eleanor, through the lens of FDR, in terms of how it affected their understanding of what a post-war world would be. And then I look at Anna through that lens, because the one thing that I would ask you to spar with me about, my new friend, and I hope I say that with all sincerity, is that Anna's relationship with Eleanor was incredibly complex. And in the 30s, they became very close friends. And it was Eleanor who encouraged Anna to really leave Dahl and to find a way to support herself. She likes John, even though there are huge political differences, and becomes a key advocate. And John and Eleanor develop their own independent relationship. And FDR is a master at playing people against each other. So the second point that I would make in terms of playing them against each other is that he clearly is playing Anna against Eleanor. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind about that. And it's not a deliberate, what am I going to do with Eleanor's situation? We now know through copious research, and I led the Eleanor Roosevelt project, which is a documentary history of her work on human rights that looked at archives from 263 archives in all 50 states and 9 nations. So I'm like obsessed with this. And what we know is that Eleanor was very involved now in the early planning of the UN. She knew about the the Manhattan Project way before other close advisors to FDR. She certainly knew at least 18 months before Truman knew. So and Eleanor is involved with the selection of Stettinius because she has a much better relationship with Stettinius than she has with Hull. So in the background here, there's somebody that's intimately involved in understanding and appreciating the importance of Yalta, not just in terms of policy, but in terms of emotion. Because Eleanor has spent 5 weeks in the Pacific a year before Yalta, which is really one of the defining moments of her life. She's in foxhole, she's in unpressurized airplane. She goes deaf in one ear. She walks 50 miles of hospital corridors and her arches fall. So when she comes back, she carries vivid images of her of wounded warriors, which FDR does not have. So when Eleanor wants to go to Yalta, she wants to go to Yalta to help FDR deal with the issues of repatriation. She wants to go to make sure that FDR adheres to the goal that he set in the Atlantic Charter, which was item number 4, as I used to tell my students in reverse order, which is the dismantling of the British Empire. And so the question that I have for you through this is about how do you think FDR's determination to prevent the resurrection of the British Empire play into his relationships with Churchill, whom he's already determined he's going to sideline before he ever gets on the plane to leave, and to ask you to consider Anna as the boys can't go. They're in uniform. And she's there. But she's there because everybody that is close to FDR is dead. FDR doesn't trust anybody except Louis Howe. And Louis Howe's dead. And Harry Hopkins is dying. And Missy has her stroke and it's totally not there. So there is no place where FDR feels safe. So the way that FDR deals with his health is the same way that he deals with his lack of friendship, is you compartmentalize it. He never discussed, when Eleanor had to give him catheters that were made of glass, she had to lift him up and turn him over and give him enemas and catheters. So there is a level of intimacy there that got too close. So the issue and how that relates with Anna is, and you're absolutely right, it's an untenable situation for her. She's finally grown close to her mother, and her father is totally ignoring her in the 30s. He only brings her back when he's really, really sick, and she's got to find a place to live. So there's that little friction, but this desperation in Anna to be a part of her father at the same time when she's really closer to her mother. You know, and her mother, I think, she's incredibly disappointed that she can't go to Yalta. You're absolutely, you nailed it. Boom, boom, boom. I mean, boom. But the quid pro quo for that is a 10-day train trip with FDR to the San Francisco conference, where she is part of that working delegation, where Stettinius and other people have come to her to ask her to intervene on issues of trusteeships. So it's complicated. And it's complicated because this is going to, I love the Roosevelts, and everybody's going to call me and scream at me about this, okay? Kathy is wicked smart, okay? Sarah is wicked smart, okay? Anna tries hard, okay? And so there's that difference. So I guess my questions for you, and rip me apart with Rooseveltian and Churchillian glee, okay? But I would like to ask you, in terms of creating your huge portrait of these bigger than life characters, which you manage beautifully. I mean, beautifully, much better, I think, than No Ordinary Time in terms of being able to pull out the people. Okay. Why did you leave Eleanor out? And because Clementine comes in and Marie comes in, but when Eleanor comes in, it's like the one-dimensional Eleanor. And how do you think the concept over dismantling empire sort of shapes Churchill's fixation on Poland? And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, like, Elite is obsessed with the UDHR. Churchill is obsessed with Poland. Okay. How does that play in that? And the last thing is, with FDR, there was never, ever a doubt in his mind that he wanted two things from Yalta. He wanted to save American lives, and he wanted to build the UN, because the UN was so important to him that the record is very clear that when the war was over, FDR wanted to turn domestic matters over to Truman, which is one of the reasons that Truman was picked, so that FDR, in fact, could be a de facto Secretary General of the UN. So I just want to throw that out in the spirit of sisterly conviction that these are intellectually rich, complex women that are deserving of immense study.
Well, thank you so much for your comments and your questions. And I don't know if we're going to have too much of a sparring match, because I think I agree with you on most of the points. Your comment about Kathy and Sarah being whip smart, which I absolutely agree that they are. I think Anna, what she also has working against her is even though she's the oldest of the daughters, she's the least experienced. Kathy and Sarah have been two of a very small handful of women who have been at the seat of power since 1941. That circle really restricted to Sarah, Kathy, and Sarah's sisters and sister-in-law, Diana Churchill, Mary Churchill, and Pamela Churchill, who of course is also having an affair with Errol Harriman. And so I think that's really working against Anna in this case. I'd push back a little bit against Anna being the choice because she's the only one left. I think that, yeah, there is, to some extent, certainly people had died. I think if he had really wanted one of his sons to come, he could have had them summoned and, could have gotten leave for them in some way as they had previously. But I think for FDR, his needs kind of change over time. And I think both Anna and Eleanor, they, on the one hand, really have an astute glimpse of FDR. You think of him as a very progressive president, and yet in the treatment of his own family, not always, because he certainly relied on Eleanor and she did incredible things and he acknowledged her for the work that she did. But I think there is also still that sort of old school impulse, as Anna writes to her mother, that women should be kept at home to keep the home fires burning. And they had this moment of commiseration in 1943 when they both hope to attend the Tehran conference, but he says no. I think for Anna, she is willing to allow, I think she does what he does in a sense, that she allows herself to compartmentalize her life in 1945. Her relationship with her mother is one thing, but she also knows that time is running out on this relationship with her father. And so while she absolutely has a closer relationship emotionally, intellectually with her mother, and unfortunately, FDR really never treated Anna with the same sort of intellectual respect that he did Eleanor. I think she's so desperate to finally have this last chance with him that she's willing to put her relationship with her mother in a box. I think that you're right, absolutely right about Eleanor being part of the inner workings of the UN and being his eyes and ears on the ground, seeing the actual developments of the war, meeting soldiers. But I think for Roosevelt going to Yalta, it's not that he doesn't want Eleanor to be part of these conversations. I think there's kind of the duality of if he brings her to Russia, to the Soviet Union, the Soviets feel an obligation that they have to make it even grander and more glamorous. And so you lose the opportunity to have working hours if Eleanor comes with, especially if other wives aren't coming. But it is somewhat of a justification, I think, in his mind for not bringing her, because he has specific objectives. She also has objectives, but he only has a limited amount of energy and capacity at this point, and so wants to be as focused as possible on those issues, even though he does value her on the other issues that will come up in San Francisco. And I think that Anna is willing to kind of follow her father's party line about it being simpler, even though she clearly has guilt about it later because of that very close relationship she has with her mother. And so if Eleanor seems one-dimensional, I think, I don't know that I spend any less time on her than Clementine Churchill or Marie Harriman. I think Marie Harriman is very little part of it. And Clementine is perhaps features a bit more because she was Sarah's primary correspondent, that they are actively having a dialogue. Anna and her mother are not actively having a dialogue throughout the time of Yalta. And I made a very conscious decision when I was writing this that I wanted it to be as focused as possible from the perspective of the three women over the course of this week. So Anna's relationship with her mother over the course of this week is not necessarily indicative of the rest of the relationship with Eleanor, but because she is compartmentalizing, she's only allowing herself to see her mother through the lens that FDR is looking at her at that time. And so by making her a one-dimensional character in her mind, it helps to justify the hurt that she knows that she's imposed on her mother, both by taking her place essentially at Yalta for her own last chance to be at her father's side before he dies, and also the immense guilt that she must feel over keeping the secret of Lucy Mercer. So I don't know if we disagree on that point.
Well, let me give you 60 seconds and then I'll shut up and it's everybody else. It's Sarah that really says you must be a debutante. It's Sarah. Sarah paid all their bills. And if Anna had not become a debutante, Sarah would have cut FDR and Eleanor off in 2 nanoseconds. Yes. So the little, the upper class thing is right, but you got to put Sarah at the top of that. Absolutely. The second thing is that to use an example of FDR playing people off against each other. I mean, when Lucy comes back, Lucy does not come back as a lover. Lucy comes back the same way that Daisy Suckley and other women cousins come in. FDR I mean, he's literally carrying the fate of the world on him. He not only has the war, he has the full brunt of the Depression on it. And if you just look at the difference in his face, you know, from 40 to 40, the middle of 42, you'll see that. So he's playing people off, and he compartmentalizes information so he can be at ease and not feel pressured that he has to perform, that he can just be, you know, the bon vivant. I mean, one of the great political lines of all time was what Herbert Hoover said about FDR, whose bust I have on my mantelpiece, just so you'll know, next to Eleanor's, is he has the political convictions of a chameleon on plaid. I would argue that his emotional relationships are the same thing. You know, he's a very focused and very lonely man.
Yes, I mean, Anna said,
Good
you know, no one knows him, and he knows no man, and no man knows him. Even his own family doesn't know anything about him. But just very quickly, your point about FDR and the British Empire and that influencing his relationship with Churchill at the time, I mean, that's absolutely, I completely agree. He's looking at the relationship with Churchill as kind of the thing of the past. You know, it was a friendship that had mutual benefit for such a long time, and still does. But he now has the bandwidth, as Britain is declining, to begin to assert the American perspective. And that absolutely is coming between them at this time. And Sarah Churchill can sense it. She can sense the change in the relationship since Tehran in December 43. And she says to her mother in a letter, is he sick, or has something come between us, essentially, or has he moved away from us? And the answer is both. I think he doesn't have the energy to manage Churchill and that relationship. And so just kind of for the sake of expediency, he can't put as much into that relationship. And so the relationship with Churchill does suffer based on the amount of reserve energy he has and his objectives of securing Soviet cooperation, which he sees as more of the way of the future and Britain is the way of the past. So I absolutely agree that the British Empire is a sticking point between them and rears its head, certainly, you know, in their relationship at Yalta. FDR just doesn't have the capacity for niceties at this point.
Well done.
Thank you.
I really liked your book.
Thank you so much. That means a great deal.
Thanks, Alida, for wonderful comments. Let's bring in another giant in our field, someone who is Mr. Ukrainian history in this country, certainly, and also somebody who has previously participated in the Washington History Seminar and is part of the Wilson Center family. Serhiy Plokhy is the Mikhailo Khushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History and the Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. A leading authority on Eastern Europe, he has published extensively on the international history of World War II and the Cold War. He's the author of, I counted quickly, 14 books. There may be a couple of translations in there, but that should be about right, including, of course, most relevant here, Yalta, The Price of Peace, published in 2010, and more recently, Forgotten Bastards of the Eastern Front, American Airmen Behind Soviet Lines and the Collapse of the Grand Alliance, as well as Chernobyl, a history of a tragedy, and then this year, Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis. His books have won numerous awards, including the Lionel Gelber Prize for the Best English Language Book on International Relations and the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction in the UK. Serhiy, welcome back to the Washington History Seminar. It's a great pleasure to have you here and listen to your comments. Turn your mic on.
Yes, thanks a lot, Christian, for this generous introduction. I'm really very happy to be back. And thanks for including me into this discussion. And Catherine, huge congratulations on this book. It reads wonderfully. And I keep learning from you. When you mentioned your thesis, I searched for your name, and certainly my report on your thesis popped up. And I remember that thesis. I certainly learned a lot. I didn't realize that the narratives about escape in World War II somehow, in terms of the genre, was related to the narratives about escape from POW camps in World War I and then rooted into the Victorian literature. So again, the thesis was great, and the book is even better. It is very well written, very well written. It makes you really jealous. But that also kind of brings a danger that you can just mistake the book for a great work of literature and maybe not notice that it's also a great work in terms of the amount of research and the quality of research that was put into it. And it is a unique book in a sense of, think about the importance of the Yalta Conference in the history and historiography and political debates here in the United States and worldwide. And every single article, every single book you take, there would be this three bigger than life personalities. And yes, there would be emphasis on maybe Averell Harriman here and there, but generally no one actually who was at Yalta at that time overshadowed, or anyone tried actually to put somebody else ahead of those big three. And Kathleen did that and did that extremely effectively. So really in the leading roles are those three women, and the big three are basically in support roles in that story. And you change perspective and you get a very different idea of what the Yalta Conference was about. I really benefited a lot when I was working on my book on the Yalta Conference from the diary or memoirs of those women, and but again they were there to shed a new light on the conference, but they were not in the focus. Here they're right in the focus, and you try and you have to think about them differently. And you think about them differently, compare one to another in relationship to the fathers that they support. But there is also one missing daughter there. And this is Svetlana Alliluyeva. She is 19 years old at that time, but there is no thought, never crosses mind of Stalin to bring her over. Or there is his son, Vasily, who is not there as well. There is one sibling or son of a major figure who is Lavrentiy Beria, the all-powerful head of intelligence, counterintelligence, secret police. And of course, as befits a son of the chief secret policeman, he is working on eavesdropping on conversations between Roosevelt and Churchill. So there are members of the Soviet families there as well, but they're performing, and they're very active in what they're doing, but they're performing very different roles. And that actually, the absence of the Soviet side there tells you also a lot about the West. And one thing that when we look back from our today's perspective at Yalta, what we assume almost is that there are two parties at Yalta. There is the West and there are the Soviets. And this is a very much Cold War perspective on things. In 1945, there is not two parties, there are three parties. And again, that is also something that is illuminated very well, not just illustrated, illuminated and presented through the role that the women are playing there. The Yalta Conference is very informal in many ways, in the sense that, again, it's described in the book. Those guys travel with risk to life for thousands of miles, but they don't have a proved agenda. They're jumping from one topic to another. They, of course, have their priorities. And there is Sarah and Anna and Katie, they add to this sense of informality. It seems to me, one of the diplomats is commenting, it's like almost like a picnic. And that creates a special atmosphere. And they very important part of that atmosphere that I have to be careful how far I am prepared to push that, but they contributing by that, they also contribute to this outstanding outcome of Yalta Conference. Because one thing is when they're traveling to Yalta, they don't know that the Yalta will be of that proportion that would really eclipse Tehran or what would happen after that. This is not a final conference. This is somewhere in the middle. It became such important, partially because of what happened there. And again, these women are a contributing factor to that. What I see also in this book is a contribution to a new kind of a diplomatic history. That it seems to me we are in the field generally trying to move toward that particular model. And I have in mind, first of all, the work done by Frank Castigliola on Harriman and the ideas that, okay, first of all, there is evolution of attitude toward the Soviet Union, and that there is also importance of the expectations of human emotions. And that book would probably, again, it is not making explicitly that kind of claim, but I think that, again, if you are interested in that kind of approach, in that kind of angle, if you're interested in interpersonal relations, if you're interested in the emotions in all that story, this book is a gateway. This book is a window into that kind of history. It's also a particular book in our era, and Catherine mentioned that, okay, how it is related to our case, how it is related to Trump family and or Obama family before that, and what does it? It's also a very old-fashioned situation, right? So there are the only women that are there are in this their ticket, their family relationship. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. Their function is basically, again, personal support and maybe clerical support. And I hope I don't betray anything. I remember my conversation with Grace Katz, and she was telling me that, yeah, her father was telling him that, well, if she is good enough, she can become a secretary to a diplomat. So that's the world that we are dealing with. These women are very important, but they're in the position that today is really very difficult for us to maybe fully understand. And that would be maybe my first question to Catherine again, if you would maybe could unpack that. I'm sure that you were thinking about that. I kind of almost can read that between the lines. So maybe I'm reading between the lines that wasn't there, but this is the question. And another question that I have is quite simplistic and maybe naive on one level, is sort of the question of so what, right? So, okay, if there would not be there, would we have a different Yalta? Would we have a different conference? Again, I was thinking about that. I kind of started answering to that question about talking about the atmosphere, but I would be interested really in listening to what you think about that. And one thing again that for me is quite obvious, that those women, they were interpreters really, on many levels, between different delegations, within the delegations themselves. And in the case of Kathy Harriman, also a communicator between the Soviet side and the West. But again, I would really love to hear whether you gave any thought to that. So what in this very old traditional diplomatic history versus the one where I'm trying to push everybody. So I would appreciate hearing what you have to say on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, your book is the gold standard on Yalta, and so to have been able to read your book and as I was beginning my research and now to be in conversation with you, it's, I take it as a great compliment that you'd take the time to do this, and thank you so much for your very kind words about the book. I think that the question of kind of the role and the influence of the women at Yalta, kind of, are they there in the classic kind of clerical emotional support, is, what is that exactly, compared to the role that women have today, and rightly so. They absolutely should have been represented in bigger numbers in official capacities before. I think that you don't have women in the diplomatic corps, for several years after Yalta. You don't even have a female ambassador in Britain until the 1970s. And so, the fact that the women were there, I find very enlightening, in a sense also about their fathers' mindsets. I think you don't think of Churchill necessarily as a feminist by any means, but I do think that he really valued the opinions of his wife and daughters in his work. And so the sense that he would kind of be the first of the fathers to bring his daughter as an aide. And at Tehran, she's acting as, a very traditional aide-de-camp role. And she's there along with the other aides, waiting in the hallway outside of the plenary sessions, along with everybody else. Although, of course, there is no mistaking that she is Churchill's daughter. So I think that the fact that he would choose to bring her is very enlightening. And I also think it's very enlightening about MPhil Harriman that he wanted his daughters to be involved in his work to the extent that it interested them. And so I think it says a lot about, for all of their other faults, these people are not perfect, but within the context of their times, that they would see their daughters in a bigger way, not to the extent that we understand women should have a role today, but that, within the context of their times, they were more ahead of their times than other people. Not entirely, but somewhat. Roosevelt, I think, has, Alita might disagree with me, but, with Anna, I don't know if he values her contributions to the same extent that the other fathers do. And I also think that, even though, they are there as, more of that kind of personal support to their fathers, and there are different ways that women have been influential throughout history, even if they don't have an overt titled position at the conference. I mean, even thinking of Amanda Foreman's work about Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire, and her role in British politics, especially in Whig politics at the turn of the 19th century, where she doesn't have the overt role. She wouldn't have the right to vote for 100 years, but those kind of softer influences, as people think of them, it's not to say that they aren't influential. I think even, we all have someone in our lives who is of utmost importance, to whom we turn in moments of doubt and crisis, and who are invaluable to us. It's very difficult to say exactly what it is that they do that makes them invaluable, and their actions and support don't leave a footprint in the historical record, and yet we know it when we see it, and we all have this person. And so I was glad to shine a light on this role somewhat at this conference. So I think that there is room for understanding kind of what are women's contributions in non-official positions in diplomatic history. I think Madame Chang is one that's fascinating in this time, that had a lot of influence. And so they don't have the same role that we would like them to have today. But that also goes back to the question of, but they are also family, and they are largely there as family. So what is the appropriate role for them to have? Do we want them to have more influence? Do we want them to be part of the meetings? I certainly did not write this kind of trying to write Ivanka Trump into this by any means. It kind of started formulating this well before she was doing any of that activity. And so it is kind of that you want them to have a bigger role, and yet you also kind of push back against the nepotistic role too. So it's that kind of interesting push and pull between our own values today and wanting to stand up for women and have more opportunity and influence in history. But also, questions that we also do have, and we struggle with today about, what is the appropriate role of someone who is a family member? I think, if Sarah Churchill had been born even 10 years later, she could have succeeded her father in politics. That would have made her a contemporary of Margaret Thatcher, and maybe that she would have had more opportunity. I certainly think she had the skills and ability to do it. And then to your second question, so what? At no point in writing this did I want to say, make the argument, if only, they'd listened to these three daughters about X, Y, or Z, there would have been no Cold War. I also don't think of the three women kind of all falling into the same role. I think they play slightly different roles. And people, I think, come into it assuming you're going to have kind of three girls against the world where they're all going to leave best friends. That's not true. Their relationships ebb and flow, reflecting the ebb and flow of the relationships of their fathers. But I think the so what is not so much if they hadn't been at Yalta, how would Yalta have been different, but rather, I think that through the appearance of these daughters at Yalta, it's very informative about relationships that we've overlooked, but relationships that were fundamentally important to these great men of history that have had no attention, but were a fundamentally important part of their lives. And I also see it as a way of helping people understand that even diplomatic history, even geopolitical history, which can feel very out of touch with our own lives. Most people think, I cannot, maybe this is too, above me and my own experience. I will never know what it's like to negotiate across the table from Stalin, so I can't relate to this. But we can all relate to the sense of being someone's child or someone's parent. And it kind of helps to bring a human understanding of the great geopolitical and diplomatic events in a way that I hope will bring people into the conversation, help them understand that these moments in history are exciting, and they are things that people, even not professional historians, can understand, enjoy, and learn from. By understanding that these things, they really are fundamentally about relationships. It's about relationships between people, between leaders, between countries, and in this case, fathers and daughters. So I see it as kind of a parallel story. On the one hand, it is the history of the Yalta Conference, but perhaps more importantly, it's a story of relationships between fathers and daughters that happen to be taking place kind of on this precipice between World War and Cold War.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Serhi, for your comments, and Catherine for some wonderful responses. So we want to bring in the audience. Please use the raise hand function to alert us to your question or comments. Before we do that, though, let me just quickly ask one question. Since the Wilson Center is the home to the Cold War International History Project, we're passionate about archives and archival documents. I'm curious, Catherine. I see from the book that you've looked at a lot of archives and files. Many of them have been, thoroughly vetted by other historians. But with your particular focus, on the daughters, were there any collections, any documents, and that stuck out, that were kind of, you had an aha moment in looking at these documents, or collections that other historians focused on different aspects of Yalta wouldn't have looked at? So if you could just briefly elaborate on that, and then we'll get to the questions.
Absolutely. The core of this book is based on the writings of the daughters themselves. And I was very fortunate to have the first opportunity to go into the archive to see Sarah Churchill's papers when they were open to outside research for the first time. And the family also very kindly made her sister Mary's papers available to me before they were open to others last year. So I was incredibly fortunate to be the first person to really comprehensively mine new Churchill documents, which you really, I don't know how many are left. So that was hugely important. It's mostly Sarah's letters to her mother, Clementine and Mary Churchill writing to each other, Sarah and Mary. It's a fascinating inner look at the Churchill family correspondence. In the case of Kathleen Harriman, I was introduced to her family thanks to the Churchill family. And some of Kathleen's papers have made their way into Averil Harriman's papers in the Library of Congress. But there also is a huge number of letters and scrapbooks that they only discovered after she passed away in 2011 that are still in their private collection. So I'm very grateful to them for making the entirety of her papers and memories from that era available to me, and greatly indebted to them. And for Anna, the majority of her papers are at the FDR Presidential Library, which were so informative. Other collections there as well, like the papers of the Dr. Howard Bruin. And it's just really enlightening to see kind of the correspondence between Anna and the doctor, even after Yalta. Really interesting. And I also had the chance to interview people like Anna's daughter, Ellie, and her son, John, who Ellie was 18 years old at the time of Yalta and remembers it so clearly. I also was able to interview Churchill's secretary, Lady Jane Williams. So it's kind of this perfect inflection point between having people who are still with us today, who knew and loved these people at that moment in time, and also the availability of papers, some of which had never been seen before. And other things like menus and film footage, things that aren't necessarily kind of the things that you would think of as the heart of archival research, but just really the stuff of everyday life, which brings so much color to a scene and makes it feel much more personal in a way that we can understand it. So I think you're on mute.
Yes, thank you. Let's go to our first audience member, Michael Goodman, if you could please unmute yourself and
Sure.
introduce yourself to our panelists, and then please ask your question.
Yeah, my name is Mike Goodman. I'm an ABD in history from Wisconsin. I got as far as that point and then finally got smart. My observations were this. There was another daughter that's conspicuously absent, and that would be Stalin's daughter, Svetlana. I was wondering, did she play any role, or was there any reason why she would not be a welcome at a gathering like this? Then my other question was, I couldn't help thinking during your presentation of another fascinating diplomatic daughter, Martha Dodd, whose father was U.S. ambassador during the Third Reich. Wondering if you could say a little bit more about Stalin's daughter and about Martha Dodd. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, so Stalin, yes, as Professor Plahey mentioned that she was 19 years old at the time. Svetlana did speak English, so she could have been an asset to her father, but he certainly would not have considered involving her in the way that the other fathers did. They also are a real low point in their relationship. She found out as a teenager that her mother had committed suicide, largely driven to it by Stalin, and she rightly holds him accountable for that. She rebels and falls in love with an older married Jewish Russian cinematographer, which Stalin objects to and sends him to Siberia. And then she rebels again and falls in love with one of her classmates and marries him at 19. His name is Grigory Morozov, and he's also Jewish. And Stalin takes exception to this once again and refuses to ever meet his son-in-law. So Svetlana is 19, married and pregnant with her first child at the time, and really not on good terms with her father. But she is there in spirit, in a sense. In 1942, Churchill met Stalin in Moscow. And at that time, Stalin brought Svetlana out almost like as if like a prop to show off that, you know, see, I'm a family man too, in an odd sense. And after that meeting, Svetlana sent Sarah Churchill a brooch, kind of daughter-to-daughter diplomacy, which is really lovely and interesting. And Sarah wears the brooch on her uniform throughout the duration of the conference. So there is a nod to Svetlana, a nod to the daughter who isn't there, which I think is a striking moment and very personal, and one that might get overlooked. And yes, yeah, Martha Dodd, fascinating figure. I'm sure, like you, have read Erik Larson's In the Garden of Beasts, and you see, a different diplomatic daughter. It's been a few years since I read that book, but I think that the Martha Dodd, I don't know that she was as involved in her father's work or the kind of knowledge of the day-to-day operations of the embassy like Kathleen Harriman was, where she really was acting as her father's envoy and representative on the ground, including in situations like the being witness to the Ketton Forest massacre, which it's unimaginable almost placing your daughter in that position, but needing someone who, again, was kind of a quasi-official representative who would be taken seriously and treated with respect, but also can give a bit of distance and plausible deniability for the findings that aren't necessarily representative of the official attitude of the American government, even though they knew it was pretty likely that the Soviets had committed the atrocities. So I think she is a different model of a diplomatic daughter, but certainly one to bring into the conversation.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dick W. If you could please unmute yourself and introduce yourself to our panelists. And Alida and Sari, feel free to join in the conversation as well, and Justin as well, if you like. Please unmute yourself, Mr. W. We can't hear you, so please unmute yourself. You need to hit the yes button there that should be popping up. No, then we'll go to
I'm sorry, no.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Nope. We had him there for a second. Let's get him back if we can. All right, let's try this again.
No question, but thank you. Sorry for the trouble.
No question, no comments? Okay, then we'll go to Ileana Sakar. Please unmute yourself, Ileana. Please, there you go. Please ask your question. Are you with us for a comment or question? No, I'm afraid we'll have to pass on these interventions. Then let me go to a question that we got through the website by Lorna Grenadier. Did these amazing women consult with each other during the conference? Did they develop any proposals that became policy? Catherine.
Yeah, so the relationships among the three daughters is fascinating. Kathleen and Sarah come into the conference knowing each other, being friends already from their time together in London earlier in the war. Neither of them has met Anna Roosevelt. And Anna, of course, has some distance that necessarily has to exist between her and the other daughters because she can't tell them the secrets that she's keeping, especially about her father's health. So I think, while I wish that they had kind of consulted each other about matters of policy and discuss them in depth, I think that they have a real sense that their obligation is to protect and promote the views and goals of their fathers and their countries first and foremost, which supersedes any friendship among the three of them. However, they do have the opportunity to go as a group into the local towns at Sevastopol and Yalta and actually meet some of the people whose lives had been upended by the war. And so in this situation, you can see them observing and commenting and conversing about the state of affairs on the ground in the local community. So that they do have a lot of conversation on that level. And I also think that you can see frustrations emerging from the daughters, among the daughters, where they are reaching the end of the Yalta Conference, and Sarah Churchill feels like her father does, that FDR should stay longer. He shouldn't rush off to his meetings in the Middle East, that he should stay and hammer out the details that remain unresolved. She doesn't say it to Anna, but she expresses in frustration to another confidant, this is Churchill's doctor, as if there is anything more important than this conference. And so she's very upset with Anna for continuing the line that FDR has said, that he has to rush off to meet other people. She's just incensed by this, again, reflecting her father. So we don't have them kind of having daughter-to-daughter diplomatic conversations, but you do see them encountering frustrations in each other that are reflective of the frustrations that their fathers are feeling amongst each other at this time.
Thank you. Let's go to Warren Sanderson. Warren Sanderson, please unmute yourself and introduce yourself to Dr. Katz and the other panelists, please.
Hi, I'm Warren Sanderson. I'm a professor of economics emeritus at Stony Brook University. I just finished your book 3 days ago and enjoyed it very much. I have 3 unrelated and what may be strange questions.
Short ones, I hope.
Short ones. First, was Roosevelt naive about Stalin, or was he just playing a weak hand and got what he could out of Yalta? Second question, hypothetically, how do you think things would have been if 3 sons had been there instead of 3 daughters? And third, very quickly, did it much matter that the 3 women were of the same religion?
So for the first question about Roosevelt and his view of Stalin, I think it was partly there certainly was a weak hand. I mean, unless you're willing to go to war against Stalin in Eastern Europe, there's a certain degree of accepting that you are kind of at the mercy of him keeping his word, especially in Poland. For that to really have been different, I think there would have had to have been very different decisions made 2, 3, 4, 5 years earlier, as early as speeding up the timeline of rearmament even, so it didn't get to the point where they were in February of 1945 with the Red Army firmly in control, especially in Poland. But I do think that he didn't have a deep grasp of the history and culture of Eastern Europe and Russia to the extent that it might have helped him. And you can see actually George Kennan and Chip Bolin discussing this in the background amongst themselves. They're two of a very, very small group of Soviet experts at the State Department in Foreign Service at the time. Kennan in Moscow with Harriman, Bolin as Roosevelt's interpreter. And Kennan kind of just wants to say, why don't we just carve it up into spheres of influence now and call it a day? This conference is pretty much a waste of time. And Bolin saying, well, at least, as the world's strongest democracy, there's an obligation to try. And Bolin comments later in his memoir that he feels that the skills that served FDR so well in domestic policy didn't always serve him as well in foreign policy, where that kind of touchy-feely politics was the bedrock of a lot of his success, touchy-feely politics, in air quotes, as he called it, which was really successful in domestic policy, but didn't lend itself especially well to dealing with Stalin, where even if he likes you and respects you, and I do think that Stalin respected FDR and the amount of admiration that he had at home for so long, but that, even if Stalin likes you, that's not going to change the way that he executes his foreign policy. So I think that maybe FDR was somewhat short-sighted in relying too much on the powers of personal persuasion. I don't know if either of our panelists want to jump in and add to that, but that's my assessment of the situation.
Yeah, I would just say that FDR made a calculated decision at the beginning of the war to let the Soviet army carry the brunt of the ground war in Europe. We did not have an army. I mean, American soldiers were training with softballs and shooting guns made out of balsa wood, and the tanks that they were trying to blow up were literally made out of, balsa wood, that thin paper airplane wood. And so one of the questions that I would add to Catherine's very astute comments is that Russia's doing the most of the bloodying work on the ground. And there's payback for that. And the question is to FDR, how many American lives are you going to save until America is prepared to go in on the ground and carry their own weight in Europe? And while I agree totally with what everyone on this panel has said about the nuances of geopolitics, there's also a fundamental issue at stake here, and that is, what have our soldiers paid for?
Thank you. We're quickly running out of time, so let me take a couple more questions that were emailed to Rachel Wheatley. One way to reach us is through email. If you're listening to us on Facebook, question by Patricia Leslie. How long did it, to Catherine, how long did it take you to write the book? And where did you get the funding to write it? Maybe a fellow writer looking for funding. Another question from Janet Bursey. I believe the book reflected people getting mail and cables in real time. How was that possible?
Yes, so it took me about 3 years, about a year and a half research, about a year and a half writing, and I finished the last year of it while I was also doing my first year at Harvard Law School. So not a lot of sleep that year. And for funding, I was fortunate to have a publisher interested in this very early. So I had a contract from Houghton Mifflin to write the book from the outset, which is terrific. Thank you, Houghton Mifflin, and has been a great partner in this. And then the second question, sorry, could you just repeat the second question quickly?
Sure. I believe the book reflected people getting mail and cables in real time. How was that possible?
Yes. So one of the great sources of information that we have is from people writing letters to Pamela Churchill, Churchill's daughter-in-law, who was married to Randolph Churchill, his son. She was also having an affair with Averell Harriman during the war, as well as with Fred Anderson, one of the top American representatives at the conference. Edward R. Murrow was another one of her lovers. He's not there. But then Peter Portal was one. He was the head of the RAF. he was enamored with Pamela. I don't know if it was truly an affair, but he wrote a 30-page letter to her, really kind of showing off a lot of what he was observing during the conference. He wrote this letter to her, which he then wanted to hand deliver for a chance to see her back in London after the conference was over. So you have people who are, returning from the conference and hand delivering the letter in person. In this, this case, Pamela, for one example. And the benefit of that is that the letters didn't have to go through the censor. And so we have these wonderful 30-page letters with not cut up full of holes by the censor. So that's one example of how things were transmitted so quickly. Also diplomatic pouches going between Churchill and Downing Street. So Sarah and Clementine were able to put their letters into the diplomatic pouch, and it was transmitted daily. So that's some of the speed that you see there.
Great, thank you so much. I think we could go on for quite a while. Unfortunately, we will have to bring this session to an end with thanks to Catherine and congratulations again on the book, and thanks to Alida, Serhi, and Justin. I'll turn it over to Eric for concluding remarks. Eric.
Thank you, Christian. I want to invite everyone back to the Washington History Seminar in just a handful of days on Monday, March 1st at 4 p.m. when we return to discuss Brandon Byrd's The Black Republic, African Americans and the Fate of Haiti, an event at which Karen Wolf of the Omohundro Institute, our co-sponsor, will join us as moderator. Till then, good night, thank you, and take care.